DC hardcore band Minor Threat had just released their first self-titled EP, which included the track Straight Edge. Despite the fact Straight Edge was only 45 seconds long, it managed to inspire an entire subculture who refrained from taking any sort of substance. The lyrics consisted of frontman Ian MacKaye detailing his sober lifestyle from the first person. What the band didn't realise is that they had accidentally opened an ideological door that couldn't be closed. Despite MacKaye detailing how the song was not supposed to be a manifesto or set of rules, he had changed punk culture forever. Shortly after release, concerts became more intimate, as many hardcore bands opted for unusual venue locations without any form of bar, and other straight-edge punk bands became physically violent towards individuals who were seen drinking at shows. What they didn't realise at the time is the subculture they had inadvertently created would continue to live on to this day and inspire countless individuals towards a healthier lifestyle. Minor Threat had managed to do this with just 45 seconds. When exploring Minor Threat frontman Ian MacKaye's early life, it's not hard to understand why he ended up inspiring what would eventually become a very positive subculture. MacKaye was born in Washington, D.C. in 1962 and grew up fully immersed within 60s counterculture. Being situated within Washington, D.C. meant that MacKaye had a front row seat to the various counterculture protests at the time. He witnessed the forefront of movements such as civil rights and anti-war. MacKaye was able to understand the messages behind these protests from a very young age, which can be attributed to his family and home life. MacKaye's father was a writer for the Washington Post, specifically a White House reporter. He was actually present within an escort car on the day JFK got assassinated. The level of intellect from MacKaye's parents allowed him to grow up in a tolerant, open-minded, and intellectual environment. Even the church the family attended was incredibly progressive, having a woman say mass in 1972, a gay marriage in 1974, and commonly hosting talks by Black Panthers and performances from local rock bands. As the hope of the 60s washed away, MacKaye's outlook on culture changed dramatically. He began to feel alienated by the prevalence and popularity of disco culture. He felt as if any real counterculture had disappeared as the 60s came to a close. Despite this, he still attempted to learn various musical instruments. He started with piano, although gave up after his mother inducted him into a more formal and structured form of learning. He then decided to pick up guitar, but swiftly gave up after finding little link in between guitar and piano. It wasn't just formal learning that MacKaye was opposed to as a child. He found himself with anti-establishment tendencies from a very young age. This ideology was actually started due to his habit of drinking copious amounts of milk as a child. He was pushed to consistently drink milk at school and began to see milk as important as food or water. When he realized much of milk's promotion stemmed from the dairy industry and he would actually in fact survive if he stopped drinking milk, he formed a mistrust of the establishment. Unlike bottles of milk, he struggled to find any sense of identity during his teenage years. Washington, D.C. was essentially a barren wasteland for young people at the time, with little to do. This, combined with the fact that his area at the time was 70% black and 30% white, made MacKaye feel completely invisible. He has since mentioned how nobody should feel sorry for him for this fact, just referring to it as a weird cultural void. With little clue on how to cure his alienation, MacKaye decided to start skating around 1975. He quickly met the eventual Henry Rollins of Black Flag, Henry Garfield. The two became very close and bonded heavily through skating, eventually forming a skate team despite having no sponsors. Skating allowed him to fit into a group for the first time and developed his understanding of the world around him. As MacKaye progressed through teenagehood, he quickly became entirely opposed to the idea of drugs and alcohol. He saw countless individuals around him attempt to rebel through the usage of this habit and quickly saw it as a pointless form of rebellion. He described that rebellion through self-destruction just results in an individual who completely neutralizes themselves to the point where they can't even rebel. Due to this, he spent much of his childhood skating and listening to rock bands like Queen, although began to form friendships with individuals who preferred punk music. He decided to borrow a few records, including Nevermind the Bollocks and Self-Titled by The Clash. At first, he thought it was absolutely terrible. The music was too harsh, grating, and often scary, but for some reason he kept coming back. His intrigue began to build, and when he heard X-Ray Spex, punk rock finally clicked as a genre. Although he enjoyed the music, it wouldn't be until 1979 that MacKaye would fully immerse himself in the local hardcore scene in DC. He decided to sneak through the window of a Cramp show. He described the venue as overcrowded, with more and more people attempting to follow him through the window to sneak into the show. He felt as if every attendee within the venue challenged various aspects of life, whether it be fashion, politics, or sexuality. spirituality. He described himself as being surrounded by not only freaks, but ideas as well. The alienation he once felt slowly washed away. He had found his crowd. The show then promptly ended when Lux yacked on stage, inciting chaos that involved tables breaking and chairs being thrown through windows. As a first punk experience, it was pretty memorable and shifted the route of Ian MacKaye's life moving forwards. He immediately formed a band named the Slinkies, who wrote and performed a song named I Drink Milk, I assume inspired by MacKaye's milk habit and resulting rebellious attitude. The band broke up not long after forming, and MacKaye instead focused on the much more important Teen Idols. Although Teen Idols was short-lived, the band incited a DIY ethos that is still very much alive within the scene to this day. The band would save every penny they earned from their various performances with the intention of creating an independent record label to release their own music. Ian MacKaye and Teen Idol's bandmate Jeff Nelson formed Discord Records in 1980. The label was intended to promote DIY culture and sold records for a heavily discounted price to allow each and everyone to afford the music. They decided to hand press 1,000 copies of Minor Disturbance by Teen Idols, using recycled materials they'd find in local bins to create the record sleeves. Although the record would be released after the band decided to split up, MacKaye and Nelson fully committed to remaining business partners and kept Discord Records going. Pretty immediately after the split of Teen Idols, the duo would form the band Minor Threat, playing their first show in December of that year, which involved supporting Bad Brains to an audience of 80 people. They would get to work creating as much music as possible, resulting in the release of their first self-titled EP in 1981. This EP would prominently feature the song Straight Edge. The lyrics in the song reflect a first-person perspective of MacKaye's decision to stay away from drugs and alcohol. Despite the lyrics being relatively simple, the song began to attract a small cult following that saw it more as an ideology than just a song. This inspired other prominent groups such as SSD Control and 7 Seconds to follow suit, heavily advocating for a straight edge lifestyle and even occasionally knocking beers out of audience members' hands. Despite its unassuming beginnings, the song slowly morphed into an entire subculture that has not only become an integral part of hardcore punk culture, but an ideology that hundreds of thousands of people subscribe to. It's why the lines for coffee stalls are usually longer than the lines for the bar at most hardcore shows or festivals. MacKaye originally reacted to this negatively. He hadn't intended to tell people what to do or lay down a set of rules for people to follow, although in recent interviews he has reacted to it more fondly. He believes the rock and roll industry consistently attempt to push the sales of alcohol, resulting in countless tragedies, and is happy to at least be an element of something that aims to fight against that. Although MacKaye has never mentioned any issues with his fans partaking in drugs or alcohol, he's often rejected taking interviews from publications that directly advertise alcohol or tobacco. Situated on the same EP as Straight Edge is the song Guilty of Being White. The song details MacKaye's experiences going to a 70% black school and being the victim of bullying as a result. When writing the song, he assumed only his close friends would hear it and subscribes to this day that the song is intended to be anti-racist. Despite this, many individuals have completely misunderstood its intended meaning, with the song being adopted by skinhead gangs in the 80s and occasionally being used by fringe groups in the years since. Shortly after the release of their first EP, Minor Threat saw a brief hiatus as the guitarist Lyle Preslar decided to go to college. During this short break, the remaining members attempted to start a new band, although this was unsuccessful as they couldn't agree on a name, meaning Minor Threat resumed making music after Preslar dropped out of college the next year. The band began seeing large amounts of success throughout the DC hardcore scene, resulting in the group consistently touring and selling a decent amount of records. This somehow resulted in a financial negative for the band. All Minor Threat records were being produced and sold through Discord, meaning they were all being priced cheap to increase accessibility for people that may have less money. This meant the band routinely made a loss on the sale of their albums and were forced to pump all their personal funds into the record label to keep up with demand. Luckily, they would get in touch with the record producer for British punk band Crass, who not only assisted in the production of Minor Threat records for cheap, but allowed for the distribution of Minor Threat music in the United Kingdom. Throughout their various tours, MacKaye became disillusioned by the direction of punk. He expressed feelings of disappointment upon meeting the bands he had looked up to for years. They were all just typical rock stars failing to push forward any new ideas. This, combined with the prominence of skinhead gangs at shows, shows threatened the identity of the subculture completely. Shows were becoming extremely violent, with skinhead gangs only attending to cause trouble and most shows ending with vandalism. The media painted DC hardcore as a place of self-destructive and nihilistic behavior, which of course just attracted individuals who outwardly exhibited that behavior to the scene. Mackay attempted to fight against this for a number of years, but by 1983 he had accepted that there was nothing he could do to combat it. Minor Threat had lost its fire. The band couldn't agree on a direction, and instead of continuing to use the name without a clear goal in mind, they went their separate ways and Minor Threat broke up. In 1984, the DC hardcore scene was beginning to fizzle out. Many of the subculture's front runners were experiencing a lack of inspiration and experimentation. This all changed when Rites of Spring entered the scene and somehow invented what would eventually become this. Rites of Spring, alongside the negative aspects coming in the form of violence and gang activity facing the scene, inspired Fire Party member and Discord Records employee Amy Pickering to send out letters and notes to all the prominent bands, attempting to start a Revolution Summer and re-inspire the punk scene of DC. The Revolution Summer attempted to create an entirely new music scene that flushed out many of the negative aspects of the previous DC hardcore. This included eliminating any sexism and pushing towards veganism and animal rights. The bands involved in this scene included Rites of Spring, Fire Party, Beefeater, and Ian Mackay's new band Embrace. Embrace slowed down the typical hardcore formula, focusing on introspective and emotional lyricism, which alongside Rites of Spring laid the foundation for emotional hardcore, and eventually, due to the slow softening of our collective brain tissues, f***ing this. Despite essentially inventing a genre and eventual international subculture, the two bands were very short-lived, with Embrace only playing 12 shows before breaking up. Mackay cited the fact that he was too focused on creating a band as opposed to just playing and creating music, and as a result of this, decided to take an extended break from playing in bands altogether, instead deciding to focus on the business aspects of Discord Records. This extended break actually inspired perhaps his most famous song, Waiting Room. Whilst hanging out at Discord Records headquarters, Mackay would slowly meet all the eventual members of his next band, Fugazi. There was no pressure to create music or form a band, they all just came together naturally, making the creation of music seamless and effortless. The band were so obsessed with just playing and creating music that they had no end goal in mind, and ended up practicing for a year straight before organising a show. They would eventually play their first show in 1987. During this time, Rites of Spring frontman Guy Picciotto would roadie and occasionally sing backup vocals for the band, and by the time their third concert rolled around, officially joined Fugazi. The hardcore community was initially freaked out by Fugazi. At the time, hardcore was heading in a more so metal direction, with the music speeding up and increasing in intensity. Fugazi was slower and focused more so on unique rhythms and riffs. Although Fugazi were vastly different from any band Mackay had been a part of before, they saw much more success in a commercial sense. The release of Repeater and the year-long tour that came along with that resulted in 300,000 sales, which was incredible for a pre-Nevermind punk band. This allowed the band to tour Europe, which was a feat Mackay was unable to achieve up until this point, with Embrace barely even leaving Washington DC. Despite already being relatively successful, Fugazi and their contemporaries were about to see a huge influx in attention when underground music and its ability to reach a mainstream audience was completely flipped on its head in 1992 with the release of Nevermind by Nirvana. Suddenly, every major label was scrambling for the next Nirvana. It seemed almost inevitable that Fugazi would be approached by multiple major labels. The band had decided that they favoured creative control over any financial incentive, and when approached by labels would ask for $5 million before immediately increasing that to $10 million if their request was accepted. What I rarely see discussed in regards to Nevermind by Nirvana is the way in which it changed concert etiquette and the knock-on effect that had on many smaller bands. MTV were consistently promoting music videos that glorified stage diving and moshing to a huge mainstream audience. This led to this same behaviour being reflected in real-life shows, although on a much larger scale than before. This wouldn't usually be an issue, hardcore was home to crazy crowds for years, but when it's combined with an increase in attendees who may or may not have experience at prior shows, it leads to an increased risk of injury. This increased risk of injury resulted in a higher risk of lawsuits for concert venues, which vastly increased the cost of security measures. Fugazi even mentioned that the barricade they had to install cost more than they got paid, which didn't even account for the extra security they were forced to hire. This became a big problem for many bands within the underground, including Fugazi. Despite this, they stuck to their morals festivals, even turning down an opportunity to headline Lollapalooza for a huge payday as they thought the festival tickets were too expensive and not accessible enough. The band continued to play countless shows throughout the forthcoming years. They complemented this with various albums that would go on to inspire countless for years to come. The band announced an indefinite hiatus in 2003, citing a desire to spend more time with their respective families as the main reason. In the 21 years since, Mackay has continued to run Dischord Records and takes pride in the fact the label hasn't written up a single legal contract or hired a single lawyer since Mackay established the label in his teenage years. The label is still active to this day. All previous members of Fugazi have continued to contribute to the Fugazi Live Series archive, with every documented recording of a Fugazi concert being uploaded and sold for whatever the consumer is able to afford. Ian Mackay formed the Evens in 2001. The musical duo continues to play shows to this day and focuses on bringing music to less traditional places such as schools, libraries or theatres. It's hard to imagine where culture would be nowadays if it wasn't for Minor Threat and Ian Mackay. Not only did they inspire a movement and subculture that has saved countless lives over the years, but also inspired countless aspects of modern hardcore and DIY culture that's still seen today. What I find most admirable about Ian Mackay is his consistency throughout the years. He started off Teen Idols as an independent band, funded by his own DIY label, and even when the concept of success and label funding introduced itself through Fugazi and the grunge explosion, he still chose to turn it down to continue to produce and release music in the way he thought it should be done. Ian Mackay has shown a unique and respectful appreciation of art throughout his various projects and actions. The only negative I can find about Ian Mackay is the fact that his influence resulted in me being forced to eat vegan slop at every hardcore show and festival I've been to.